She was attacked by Palestinian terrorists with a machete who left her for dead, and now they might be released as part of a hostage exchange. I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Tal Hartuv, thank you very much for joining me. Obviously, this is a very difficult moment for you and for all of Israel, but you have a particularly unique story and position. So first off, could you just tell me and those watching what happened to you all those years ago?
Okay, well, briefly, I was working as an Israeli tour guide. I was guiding a Christian American tourist in Israel proper, and we were accosted by two Palestinian terrorists who held us at knife point, machete point, for half an hour, and then they found my Israeli ID. They assumed that my friend Christine was also Jewish, so they made me take off my shoes. They tied our hands behind our back with my laces. They took off my Star of David. They gagged us, put us on our knees, Allahu Akbar, and they started hacking away. And I'm on my side. Christine's like a couple of meters away on her back. And the only thing I could do was to play dead. And with the little medical knowledge I had, I kept my eyes open, thinking that's how people play dead. And while they're hacking at me and breaking bones, I'm watching Christine hacked to death before her eyes, and they leave thinking we're both dead, and they come back to confirm we're dead. They turn me over on my back. They stab me right near the heart. It missed my heart by 4 millimeters, and they leave. And then I have like one last commission in life, which is to die nearer where I parked the car so the police can find my body. And I managed to stand somehow, and I turned my back on what's left of Christine. And step by step, if I can tell you about my injuries, I had 18 machete wounds, over 30 broken bones, snapped ribs, collapsed lung, dislocated shoulder, broken shoulder blade, crushed sternum, bones in my lungs, a sliced diaphragm. And in that state, gagged, bound, barefoot, I managed to reach help. Surprisingly, I just thought I'd get nearer somewhere I could die. And the long and short of it is that during this initial encounter with them, I managed to stab one with a penknife I had, just nick him with a penknife in the nuts. And it was his blood on my sleeve, in my soaked, bloody sweatshirt. The police could extract some DNA, and the terrorists were caught. And months later, I was in court with them, and they actually confessed to murdering another Israeli lady 10 months previously. So the police solved that murder, and they were put in prison. So that's my story. And can I just say something a little bit? We're both Brits by origin, and I love irony, right? But I remember getting to the hospital, and the last words I hear in this terrible state, I was dying, I was critically injured. The last words I hear in the operating theatre was from one surgeon to another who said, "Muhammad, give me the knife." Meaning, wow. It was, I want to say this, and I say this every single time, it was an Israeli Muslim surgeon who saved my life. And that's very, very important for me to say, because I have a lot else to say about Islam and jihadism and the situation in Israel and the terrible pogrom we endured on October the 7th.
Well, that is an extraordinary story, and thank you for sharing it with me, as you have in the past, I know, and you've been actually, over the years, very forthcoming with sharing the details of that harrowing story, which can't have been easy. Going through it was one thing, going through a court case to get the terrorists punished is another, and then telling it to the media is yet another ordeal. So I know that since that time, you actually changed your name because you almost wanted a fresh start. On the 10th anniversary, you told me of this happening. And back then, you were called Kay Wilson, for anyone who wants to go and look up more details about the story in the court case, because it is quite extraordinary. But the reason we're talking today is because yesterday, of course, we saw the first part of this hostage release blackmail deal that Hamas have done with Israel. And we saw the wonderful, amazing return of those three women who've been held in captivity for 471 days. And yet the flip side of this deal, the dark side of the deal, is the blackmail part, that the Israelis have agreed to release Palestinian prisoners. Many in the Western media here, the BBC and the like, have had these slightly romanticized reports and interviews with those being released as if they are somehow equivalent to the people who were abducted from Israel, from their homes, from their beds, from their families, and kept in horrific conditions in the Gaza Strip. But you have a particular insight into this because the terrorists who tried to kill you, who left you for dead after stabbing you with that machete, may now be released as part of that deal. Tell me, how does that feel?
Okay, I'll tell you how it feels. If I can just make a comment about the name change, because I think it's also relevant to who we are becoming as a people. I'd spoken all around the world, as you know, and you kindly mentioned. I had a best-selling memoir published under K. Wilson. And what I felt as the years went on is that I was becoming known for what happened to me. And I also felt I did what I could. And I had like a eureka moment. It's like, no, there's more to me than being stabbed. So I thoughtfully changed my name. I took a lot of thought about why I call myself Tal. I legally changed my name. And it was very important for that mental health space, for that healing. And it's got like the butterfly, you know, the caterpillar. And I feel mentally stronger because of it. And after October the 7th, I felt, okay, I've had anonymity for 3.5 years. I'm back on the speaking scene. So how does this make me feel? Well, how it makes me feel is probably not surprising. Because I lived with that barbarity. And in court, by the way, when the judges asked these savages, like, why did you murder an American Christian? And they said, oh, we thought she was Jewish. It was so blasé and so nonchalant. And the sheer violence of it all, just I haven't found words for it at the moment. But the deal, on one hand, it made me feel, not on one hand, it made me feel sickened with the raided injustice of it all right? Because not only have they been getting fat salaries from British taxpayers' monies over the last year, they're now going to leave prison as millionaires. I mean, nobody's talking about this either, all right?
Just for those who don't know, explain how they've been given these salaries in return for having tried to kill you and for having killed your friend.
Well, I didn't know anything about it until, obviously, it all happens to me. You know, I live in a very small world, and then your world is shattered and it opens up. I learned, that the Palestinian Authority is a recipient of foreign funding. By the way, it has more money than any other country in the world as far as foreign aid goes. And what they do, what the British government does, and the European Union and the Americans under Biden, is that they give the Palestinian Authority billions, I mean billions, not millions, billions of dollars, all right? And interestingly, I was at, before I say that, I'm sorry, billions of dollars, and then it's transferred to the Palestinian Authority. And then that money, it's kind of what's called given in good faith. And how do I know this? Because I was at a European Union Purim party. I gate crashed it with a neutral friend, Brian of London, as he's called. Met the European ambassador, and I dressed up as myself. I put a plastic knife through my chest and blood all over, like fake blood. I mean, he was so shocked. And
it's good you got your sense of humour still about things, I must say.
No, I think it's really important to make a visceral point. And he finally agreed to speak to me with Brian, and he said something. He said, well, the money given to the Palestinian Authority is fungible. I didn't even know what that word meant. I've gone and look it up. So basically, it's money given in good faith. And once it's given in good faith, the likes of the British government do shut eye, and they're not interested where it goes. So that money that goes to the Palestinian Authority is then transferred to these prisoners and their families. It's really a monthly murder stipend. Now, I still have British citizenship. I still have a brother in London. And what that means is the likes of my dear brother, who goes to work and pays his taxes, his money is funding the people who tried to murder me. Okay, so that's the funding issue.
Because those people, in jail who've been found guilty of terrorism acts, like your attackers, are then given stipends and pensions, and their family as well, by the Palestinian Authority, supposedly the moderate Palestinian faction. They are given that money as a sort of reward or payment or welfare, because they literally engaged in acts like the one that nearly ended your life. And that money, as you say, funded in no small part by foreign aid, including British taxpayers' money. So absolutely shocking, I think, to many people. And I remember you had a piece in the Daily Mail some years ago all about that, where they profiled this horrific element of it. But so now, as if that weren't bad enough, there is this prospect that in order to get back the abductees who were taken by Palestinian terrorists on October the 7th, they are now going to swap people who've committed horrific crimes, like the ones who tried to kill you and who did kill your friend. They're going to swap them for those innocent abductees, right?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think Israel's always made a mistake from the day one with what we call the advocacy side of things. You know, this is a war against Hamas. Fine. But if you look at the footage, all right, from the invasion on October the 7th, this was not just Hamas. There was also the PLO, there was Fatah, there's the PLFP, there was the Islamic Jihad, and of course there are these thousands of innocent civilians, all right? So none of these people are moderate. And the blame isn't entirely on Hamas. That's really, really important to say that. And secondly, yes, I wouldn't say it's a swap. What I'd say is that it's a ransom. We are paying a ransom for these dear people who are in the most terrible conditions for 15 months.
And I think you make a very good point there. I mean, I'm always pretty careful when I talk about these things over the last 15 months, not to say Hamas terrorists, but to say Palestinian terrorists, because the terrorists who invaded on October the 7th were, as you said, from all sorts of factions, and often actually not formal fighters, to use a BBC word or anything like that. I mean, I watched as many videos as I could of the horrors that they carried out on that day. I felt it was my duty to do so. And I saw regular people in sandals and civilian clothes, as well as those who dressed in terrorist uniforms. And more than that, I also heard in their own declarations from the dash cams in their vehicles as they were driving into Israel for the attacks, they shouted about how they were willing to die in their thousands for jihad. So this wasn't even specifically about Palestinian rights, reclaiming land they believed was theirs. This was actually far more. It was religious war against the Jews carried out by an assortment of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, some of them so-called innocent civilians. So I do think that's a very important point. What do you know about the guys who attacked you? What were their affiliations, if any?
They had a very weak affiliation. Apparently one was affiliated, and it's a case of where they put them in Israeli prisons as well. That was something to do with it. They weren't religious, as much as I know, but one was affiliated with Hamas, and the other was affiliated with Fatah. All right, so you know this. We've made the mistake of drawing very sharp lines and separating these different factions. And you so rightly said it, Jonathan. We're talking about jihadism. That's what it is. It's jihad. It's Islamic jihad. And there's no moderates in this game. But in fact, you know, I tell you something, is that it's not just the barbarity of October the 7th, which was so difficult to swallow. Because I kind of wasn't surprised by it. I was shocked by the invasion, of course, right? But I wasn't shocked by the barbarity. But just a few weeks ago, if you talk about jihadism, I watched your incredible courageous speech at the Oxford Union with Musab and the other person, I forget who it was.
Yosef Haddad.
Yosef, that's right. And I look at those people in suits and ties, right? The pillar of decency and civilization, the Oxford Union, and I think you faced a certain kind of jihadism there. You know, it starts with words. It starts with how we talk about each other.
Well, you're sounding a bit like the British police here. It depends what jihad means. But I think, actually, I think you're right, because in its truest sense, jihad can refer to various kinds of behavior. And in a way, there were people in that room who, the anger I saw there, the vitriol, the verbal assault, thankfully it was only verbal, was palpable. And I must say, it wasn't normal debate or disagreement. It was very, very aggressive, very nasty. And it did feel like there was certainly a cultural, if not religious, element that lay underneath a lot of it. So thankfully, I will say it was, in my opinion, nothing like the horrors that obviously you and then also many of the people on October the 7th and others in Israel's history have undergone. Thank goodness, thank God. But back to your story, it is obviously part of a wider jihad, of a wider war that's going on in Israel and in the West and around the whole world, actually. And as you said, you, of all people, I guess, weren't surprised on October the 7th, because the brutality that we all witnessed, many people will have been shocked by it, and it would have been the first time they witnessed this sort of thing. But of course, you had witnessed it, you'd experienced it literally at the sharp end. This has happened to you. And now, part of what happened on that day, the abduction of innocents, is being linked to the return of the people who did that to you. Those very people could be released. Could you tell me, how did you find out that is a possibility? And are you certain, for example, that they may be released as part of this blackmail?
I was very careful in my social media post that, somebody called me. I'm not allowed to disclose who it was, but somebody in the know, let's put it like that. And they said there was a very high chance that these savages will be released. So we wait to see. I knew they wouldn't be released at the first stage, right? These were like the low apples on the tree, so to speak. But the next stage is going to be much more costly for Israel. And I must say something, because obviously it stirred in me. Anxiety is not the right word, but just this sense of injustice, right? And I didn't know who to be angry at. It's like, am I angry at the Israeli government? Am I angry at, the hostages, the hostage family? And I really had to get a grip with myself, right? And say, no, I can't do this. And this is where I think we must have nuance as Jewish people, all right? It's not a this and that. It's either this or that. It's like, I can feel compassion, and I'm so glad these hostages are home. Really, I'm the first one to cry and weep, followed by 10 other million people. But I can feel on one hand this joy, this heart-wrenching joy. But on the other hand, I can also hold this raging sense of injustice. And I think the way also as a people that we're going to get through this terribly difficult time is that we meet each other, even though we might have opposing reasons to be in pain, right? I want to look those hostage families in the eye and just hug them and say, I'm so glad your loved ones are home. I'm so glad, even if it's at my cost. But then I want to go to people like myself and I say, I'm so hurting that your savages got out of prison. It's always complex. Jewish life is always complex. But as you've rightly said, the whole issue, it stirs up fantastic emotions.
I think all life is complex. You're right. The Jewish people have certainly experienced our fair share of complexity, but things aren't black and white. And that's part of the problem with how this war and this ongoing conflict are often portrayed, I think, in the news, particularly here. There's this sense of goodies and baddies, black and white, and things are very much more complex in some respects. So often, I think, when it comes to Israel's actions, there's a underappreciation in the presentation here, and therefore in the reception by the wider audience, that Israel's choices are often between two really horrible options, as in this case, the horrible option of these abductees just being left indefinitely in the Gaza Strip in the hands of savages, or the option of releasing savage, brutal murderers and terrorists. And I think the two options are dreadful, but the choice seems to be that it's better to save those lives in Gaza that can be saved, and many have already been lost among the hostages, and risk future lives, because there is something like an 80-something% chance, or not just a chance, in past deals, 80% of the terrorists released have gone back into terrorism. Many have actually been rearrested. So many that were exchanged for the Gilad Shalit handover have gone back into prisons for terrorism again. So I think that there is that sense. But your position is very interesting as well, because it's not just about possible future acts of terrorism and deaths. It's an injustice to you and other victims of the terrorism of the past that you were meant to receive some sort of justice in your attackers being put in jail. So they are being released, not even in return for some kind of repentance or good behavior on their part. On the contrary, they're being released because of the brutality and terrorism of other people. So terrorism is being rewarded because of more terrorism. For you, that must feel extremely difficult. And as you say, it's not about blaming Israel or blaming the government or blaming anyone in particular. It's just an acknowledgement of that horrible injustice, right?
Yes, and you use the word, it's complex. I said it's complex, but, you said it's not black and white. I tell you what is black and white. And if the West, especially, I'm talking about the West, because the West is so influential in what happens in the Middle East. The black and white is it, that the war that they started, right, and the way we respond to that war, ours is a just war, all right? Completely just war. There's no grey area about trying to kill those who murder and behead and rape and maim. That's a black and white issue. Now, if the Western powers had held on to that notion from the beginning that this is a just war and that evil must be defeated, we wouldn't have ended up today in this complete mess that Israel finds herself in. But instead of that, as Douglas Murray says, we've had to fight with one hand behind our back. We've been having double messages from the Biden administration. On one hand, there's arms. On the other hand, there's an arms embargo of some things. It's like we're getting very, very mixed messages. So what should have been black and white from the beginning turned into, for the West, a very grey area morally. In fact, it didn't even become grey. As you know very well, it became that Israel, it is an astonishing achievement of narrative that Israel ends up being the ones doing genocide. And you know what's interesting too, Jonathan? It's like I was looking on the X and, not the legacy media, but social media. And even though there's not a gun that's been fired in Gaza today, the protests in Europe against the state of Israel are getting bigger and bigger. Now, it's simply a war against the Jews. And the moment we can all grow up and say and call it what it is, I think we'll all be in a better moral place to understand what's happening and what is actually behind this awful dilemma of paying a ransom for these dear hostages.
I agree with you on that, and I will say that it is a war on the Jews, but the war on the Jews is also part of a much broader war on the West and on civilization as we know it, on Judeo-Christian values, which ultimately are based on the values of Judaism and Jewish law. So I think it's much wider than that, and I think that's why it's important also that you speak out not just as a Jew, but as a Brit. So as a British person, you must have thoughts on how the government here is reacting to the war, right?
Of course. By the way, we talk about the British government. We've known each other several years, and I remember writing to every MP in the British government saying I'm a British Israeli citizen. I sent photos of my gory stab wounds. I was trying to stop them funding the Palestinian Authority. The only response I ever got was, "What's your postcode?" Right? That's it. There was no letter from them, nothing. I've been completely, ghosted by the mainstream British media, even though I've set up, a very beautiful initiative a few years ago with a Palestinian Muslim in a so-called Palestinian refugee camp to educate children. All right. What's the first thing I told you in this interview? A Muslim surgeon saved my life. But you think that the BBC or Sky News or The Guardian or The Independent have ever had me on to be interviewed? So that's, look, from the media point of view, I knew that would happen because look how they treated me, all right? You mentioned it earlier on in the interview. The BBC can't even bring itself to call these savages who held a British-Israeli young woman in captivity for 15 months. They can't even call these people terrorists. Your foreign minister, not mine, but you know what I mean, David Lammy, all right? He could call for the end of the war without even mentioning the hostages. Emily Damari's family, right? They're so frustrated because the British government were simply a no-go zone. And I find that morally objectionable. I'll tell you another thing, if I may, Jonathan. Sorry I'm talking so much. But when you say it's an ideology, right, because it's not just a war against the Jews, you are so right. I've been following all this terrible grooming and raping and in some case murder of these non-Muslim children. Now, why do I say that? Because, again, it's all how we frame the issue, right? It's not a matter, this isn't a matter of black and white. This isn't about people with brown skin doing crimes against people with not brown skin. This isn't even at its core a matter of Pakistanis against English children. What it is, and it must be reframed, this idea of sexual slavery is part of Islamic jihad. And that's, it is a war against the Jews, but in Western civilization, you have Islamic jihad with sexual slavery, sexual grooming of children, plenty of terror attacks all around. And it's not an issue of skin color or nationality. It's an ideology. It's an evil theocracy that has actually seen to it the murder of many Muslims who don't agree with their own fanatical stream of thought.
Well, that's definitely, I think, the case, because, you look at, even here in the UK, when you can find people chanting what I heard people chanting in Gaza after the announcement of the ceasefire, Kaiba Kaiba Ya Yahud, which of course is an Islamic chant which references a slaughter of Jews in Kaiba and the rape of Jewish women, because that's what happened in that battle. And I think that the other thing that always I've noted, over the last 15 months, what we saw on October the 7th, among other things, was sexual violence, rape of women as part of that jihad, as part of that warfare that was waged. And then there was a lot of denial in some quarters that it had even happened, as if it was unthinkable. But actually, sexual violence is often part of warfare, and it's often part of Islamic warfare, because there is reference to it even in foundational Islamic texts. So the point is not to say, as you said, the surgeon that saved your life was a Muslim doctor. It's not about individual Muslims, but it is about the idea that many of the people who carry out these atrocities do so, not just in the name of Islam, but with reference to actual parts of Islamic teaching and how they interpret it. And it's not a minor problem, either for Israelis or around the world. These are problems that we're all becoming, sadly, increasingly used to hearing about and experiencing, whether it's attacks here in the UK or whether it's attacks there in Israel or elsewhere in the world. So I think it is important that we can confront really the underlying nature, culture, ideology underneath those sorts of attacks, because unless we do, I don't think we're going to get to a position where we can even begin to deal with the problem. And I think that voices like yours obviously carry a lot of weight because of what you've experienced personally. And on that basis, I suppose I'd like to ask you, what would be your message to Keir Starmer? What would be your message to David Lammy? You say you are still a British citizen as well as an Israeli citizen, and yet Britain, under this government and even previous governments, continues to support UNRWA, the UN body that is corrupted by its associations with Hamas and extremism in Palestinian society. The government continues to do very little about the hostages. I think Emily Damari's release had very little to do with Britain's intervention, because I don't think there was much. And similarly, they still call for abstract notions like a sort of two-state fantasy rather than practical solutions to the conflict. So what would you say to them right now if you could speak to David Lammy, if you could speak to Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, to David Lammy, I'd say, I am a woman. Sorry. I had to get that one in. But no, listen, what I'd say is let's give them the benefit of the doubt, all right? Let me just give them the benefit of the doubt. I would say your money, the British people's taxpayers' money is what enables other people to attack me and hold hostage Emily, in Gaza, all right? And that money has to stop. Secondly, I would say I will pray to the Master of the Universe that you would have courage and you'd have discernment. You'd have the discernment to understand that what is happening in your country is what Muslims would call stealth jihad, all right, a conquest of culture, an infiltration into government systems and the establishment to impose barbaric values slowly. And say, may God give you the discernment to see that this is what's happening. And then when you have the discernment, may God give you the courage to speak out against it and stop it. That if you're going to be a leader, you need to have some courage. You can't be friends with everybody. That's what I'd say to them. And that is sorely lacking in the British government. They're arresting all the wrong people.
And just to close then, as the release of the abductees continues over coming weeks, if it does indeed continue, and there are then releases of dozens or hundreds of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, people who've been put in prison because they've been found guilty of attacks like the one on you. What are your feelings going forwards about that? And how do you balance the shared national joy over seeing the return of the abductees with the massive injustice that you must be feeling, and plenty of others in Israel?
Well, nobody's ever accused me of being imbalanced before, so I wouldn't want to start down that slippery slope. I think it's a matter of holding these two contradictory emotions, in paradox. And it's, look, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, we've always had to live with tension, always with paradox. Nothing has ever been straightforward. We've had the state of Israel, let's say the Jewish people, we've had everything thrown at us for thousands of years, forced conversion, exile, Holocaust, pogroms, you name it. So I think if we could step back and look at history, it's always helpful to look at history. It gives you perspective. And I think that this is history in the making, what's happening now. What a fantastic time to be alive, Jonathan, and fantastic in the broad sense of the word, right? And I have hope, although it's extremely painful. If I look at my people and I say, well, we've survived, I personally never thought that I'd be in a situation where I could even leave my room after the attack, let alone get back a little bit of a sense of humor and be active and make friends. It's like I would never have believed it. So I think there is something so beautiful and resilient about the human spirit. And I think if I can do that, if it's happened to me with the help of my community, I think that Israel, we will go forward from this. It will take time. Things take time. But I'm not able, may I never be a nice person. May I never come into a situation where I feel at ease with everything, right? Oh, that's good. That's behind me. That's settled nicely, because then my passion dies. I'm glad in a way that I feel such a sense of injustice and such a sense of compassion for the hostages, right? Because that's what's motivated me to get on this Zoom call and talk to you, right? Because it's not all about me and what I feel. I want my lens in the world to be wide enough to incorporate other people too.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for your magnanimous outlook on life. I think we could all learn something from that, and hopefully we all will. And I think that as this goes forwards, we will all watch with a mixture of emotions similar to yours, joy and gratitude for the return of people from the horrors that they've experienced, sadness at those who may return who are no longer alive, and a great deal of sadness about the whole situation, all the people who've suffered as a result of that war that was started on October the 7th by the Palestinian terrorists invading Israel. And indeed, sadness and anger and frustration at the injustice of this blackmail, almost criminal exchange that Israel has to make in return for bringing people home. So let's all stick together. And I agree with you that this is a war of righteousness, and it is a righteous war because it is a war fighting against the barbarism that really wishes to kill and to glorify death. And people like you and the spirit of Israel really show that there is more glory in life and in goodness and more light in that than there is in that kind of darkness. So thanks so much for speaking to me today, and more power to you, Tal.
Thank you, Jonathan.